one thing that I wanted to make a sort of small point was that when we're talking about the origins of neutral mutation, neutral evolution, I think one of the important things to realize is that people have been talking about neutral molecular evolution for many years. So even in 1964, Kimura and Crow produced the infinite alleles model, and that model is basically applied to different systems of alleles. It's applied to neutral alleles, to different kinds of selection regimes. They do the neutral case because you can solve the math easily when S equals 0. So you can make the model work. But they say in that paper that they don't believe that a system of neutral alleles exists in nature. And I think the important move, at least one of the important moves right around the late 60s, is that Kimura and others become convinced that these models that they had produced in the past actually apply in the world.
And what caused them to make that change in their attitude?
That biochemical evidence.
Not the revelation of huge amounts of variation, which they couldn't
They
deal
said
with.
it, well, Kimura says it is consistent with that large amount of variability. But I think that in like the 67 paper that Will has open right here says it's synonymous mutations. It's incontrovertible in 1967 to him that synonymous mutations must be neutral. I mean, so they have to be real.
So,
But he
synonymous
also,
ones,
but
we're
he
talking
cites your paper, you and Hubby, so, I mean, it's clear that he's got that in
thinking
mind.
about it. Yeah. So, but I think that's an important shift in the way he's thinking about even these models and what they're models of. So neutrality goes from being a mathematically elegant way of doing modeling to suddenly something that is real.
So, Michael, I'm trying to understand, are you now proposing that in fact, in no interesting and important sense, was the population genetic side of the neutral theory an attempt to rationalize the observations of huge amounts of variation? That not only was my suggestion incomplete, but in fact it was wrong. Right. Is that your current position?
I'm saying we have insufficient evidence to support that claim.
You begin to sound like a member of the Bush administration.
Well, you know, history should be based on evidence, and
I understand.
Will may have more evidence than I have access to. I just have access to Kimura's published record and some letters, but Will's talked a lot, and he may have a better understanding of what Kimura was thinking at that time. But from the published record, he was thinking about it, but it's not obvious that that was as decisive.
So just let me ask you one further question. So as an historiographical issue, the kind of inference which I made is really not legitimate.
It's your inference.
and ought not to be taken seriously because there's no evidence for it.
Well, you may have more evidence than you actually presented in the book. I don't know that.
No, all the evidence I have is what I said in the book, namely what the claims had been about the nature of genetic variation and how much there was, and mutations there being a wild type and all mutations being deleterious deviations from that.
Yeah.
No, you know it all.
Well,
so why not come out and say
my
that?
view is, wow, what an interesting historical correlation you pointed out.
No, the way it explained Lewinton, that's the point. It may explain.
Well, it's things, yeah, but yeah.
I'm just trying to know where we are. That's all.
Could I just quick something on this? I mean, we do know that Kimura had an interest in load for a long time leading up to the publication of that paper. And as Will, you said in this nice little paper that circulated around our group, and I hadn't read previously about Kimura's contacts with the ABCC geneticists. And they were all very concerned with load. And load was, so you localized the problem for me in a really interesting way. Load was a big issue in Japan at the time. And so it certainly wouldn't be surprising that Kimura would be very sensitive to load issues based on standing variation. Now that drops out of the argument for him, but I think that would be additional evidence that it was important for him at the time. He was conditioned to be thinking.
So that's reason for my distinction between origin and development.
But see, the key piece of evidence that led me to believe that your account in 74 wasn't right is that he doesn't use a load argument in 68. He uses a cost of selection argument that has to be based on the 65 evolving genes and proteins data, which are rate of evolution. It's this data. It's
Yeah.
not
He does
standing
refer to the
vari.
standing variation.
He says it's consistent with the standing variation observed by
Yeah.
Lewontin and Hubby.
And I think we're trying to make an inference about how he changed his mental state. But, he was, of course, very loaded with genetic laws arguments from all his education, etc. But still, he reminds in many places, and I think it is consistent with the 68 paper, that the evidence that changed, that made him think that this hypothetical theoretical case of neutral mutations was the real case in the world because of the supposed high rate of
Substitution.
of substitution in proteins.
Which he would have gotten from
So-
ABCC2, right? They're doing cost of selection arguments, right? That's just dynamic load. So it's not different from that. It's just we need the evidence of how he was thinking about that electrophoretic variability.
Mhm.